At around 7:30 on the morning of Saturday, March 2nd, 1996, 25-year-old Alicia Faye Reynolds said goodbye to her husband Mark at their home in Baltimore, Maryland, and started the 150-mile drive south to Charlottesville, Virginia, to spend the day shopping with her mother. By 10:30 a.m., her mother was inside the mall waiting patiently for her daughter to arrive, but sadly, that moment would never come. And by 4 p.m., panic set in when police called to report that Alicia's Mercury Tracer had been found abandoned on the shoulder of Route 29 with no sign of Alicia anywhere. Alicia was born Alicia Faye Showalter on August 5, 1970, in Harrisonburg, Virginia, the firstborn of Harley and Sadie Miller Showalter, and one half of a set of twins. Her brother Patrick was born alongside her, and they grew up in a close-knit Mennonite family in the Shenandoah Valley. Alicia, by her parents' description, was an outgoing, athletic individual who was full of life. She graduated from Harrisonburg High School and earned her undergraduate degree from Goshen College. By 1996, she was a fourth-year doctoral student in pharmacology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, working on research aimed at developing vaccines against bacterial disease in developing countries. She had married Mark Reynolds, and the two were building a life together in Baltimore while she finished her degree. The night before the drive, Alicia called her mother, Sadie, and asked her for her cell phone number just to have it in the car, and wrote it down on a piece of paper. The next morning, Sadie drove from her home in Harrisonburg to the Fashion Square Mall and walked to the petite department inside the Leggett's store where she and her daughter always met, but Alicia wasn't there. So Sadie walked around the mall a bit before checking again, but there was still no Alicia. So she decided to wait outside in a spot where she could watch the cars coming into town on Route 29. 45 minutes after first arriving, at 11:15 a.m., she walked to a mall payphone and called Mark to express her initial concerns. However, Mark told her that Alicia was probably delayed due to the foggy and drizzly weather and suggested she keep waiting. By 2 p.m., when Alicia was still a no-show, Sadie left the mall and returned home. Once there, she reached out to Mark again, who now realized the severity of the situation and phoned the police. At 4 p.m., everyone's worst nightmares were confirmed when police called to inform them that Alicia's white Mercury Tracer had been found abandoned on the shoulder of Route 29 in Culpeper County, with her purse still inside, the hood propped open, and no sign of Alicia anywhere. Once news had spread, several witnesses came forward and reported seeing a young woman standing beside her car, pulled onto the shoulder with its hood raised, talking to a man. Behind her car was a dark-colored pickup truck. The witnesses gave a consistent description of him, a white man, somewhere between 35 and 45 years old, standing between 5 feet 10 and 6 feet tall, of a medium build, with light to medium brown hair. Days later, when police released a composite sketch of the suspect, phone calls started pouring in from women reporting eerie encounters they had in the same area where Alicia's car was found. Over the previous several weeks, through February and into March of 1996, nearly 24 women had been approached on Virginia highways by a man in a pickup truck. He would pull alongside them, blow his horn, and flash his lights, gesturing that something was wrong with their vehicle. Some of them even pulled over. In every single case, when the car was later checked, there was nothing wrong with it at all. One woman from Quantico had stopped for him on Virginia Route 234 near Dumfries and said he convinced her that the brakes on her car were failing and offered to drive her safely home, which she accepted. However, after driving only a short distance, he attacked her and threatened her with a screwdriver. She threw open the passenger door and jumped out of the moving truck, breaking her leg in the process, but thankfully was able to escape. Shockingly, the man had provided his name, Larry Breeden, and state police released it alongside the sketch. While criminal profilers almost immediately labeled it as a fake name, it still led to the investigation and questioning of people in Virginia with the same name, but they were all eventually cleared of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Alicia was still missing. That is, until May 7, 1996, when an employee at a care facility in the Lignum area of Culpeper County, roughly 15 miles east of where Alicia's car had been found, noticed buzzards circling over a stretch of clear-cut timberland owned by a paper company. He went to see what they were after, and in the middle of the clearing, he found a shallow grave with Alicia's body in it. Due to its remote location, investigators believed that the suspect was very familiar with Culpeper County. While her death was ruled a homicide, her actual cause of death could not be determined due to it being exposed to the elements for more than 2 months. On November 2, 1996, Virginia State Police held a news conference and released a criminal profile. Special Agent Larry McCann told reporters that the man had been prowling those highways, looking for a specific kind of victim, and that Alicia had fit what he was looking for. He added that he didn't believe the suspect had originally intended to kill her. He also didn't think it would stop there, and bluntly said that once a person crosses that line, crossing it again was much easier. He believed the man had lived near Culpeper at some point or passed through it regularly, and he put it this way: for some reason, he knows Culpeper, but Culpeper does not know him. 3 days later, the case aired nationally on Unsolved Mysteries, and more tips poured in. Over the next 3 decades, Virginia State Police would ultimately work more than 10,000 leads, but none of them helped solve the case. For years, the most prominent name attached to the case was Darrell Rice. He had pleaded guilty to trying to force a female bicyclist into his pickup truck in Shenandoah National Park in 1997, and while he was serving that sentence, federal prosecutors indicted him for the 1996 murders of 2 women at a campsite in that same park. Investigators publicly named him as a person of interest in Alicia's murder as well, and they pursued that theory hard. However, the federal murder charges collapsed in 2004 when the physical evidence didn't match him. Then, in June of 2024, the FBI announced that the new DNA testing had conclusively identified an entirely different man, a convicted serial sexual assaulter from Ohio who had died in prison in 2018, as the killer at that campsite, and Darrell Rice was publicly cleared. He was never charged in Alicia's case, and there was even less evidence tying him to it than there had been to the 2 women killed in the park. In a crazy turn of events, weeks after his exoneration was announced, on July 5, 2024, he was struck by a vehicle while riding a bicycle in Sheridan County, Missouri, and killed. He was 56 years old, and his attorney said he probably never even knew his name had been cleared. Alicia's mother, Sadie, on the other hand, carried a completely different theory. She felt that Richard Ivanitz was a strong suspect. Ivanitz was a serial sexual assaulter and killer operating in Virginia during the exact same period, responsible for the abductions and murders of 3 girls in Spotsylvania County, beginning in September of 1996. As police were closing in on him in Florida in June of 2002, he took his own life. However, police never found any evidence to tie him to Alicia's murder. Alicia's case would gain attention once again in late 2023, when her sister publicly noted that the 1996 composite sketch bore a resemblance to Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer, who pleaded guilty to 7 murders on April 8, 2026, and was sentenced to multiple consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, no evidence has ever surfaced to connect him to Alicia or the Route 29 corridor. Over the years, the unknown suspect who terrorized the area between February and March of 1996 has been dubbed the Route 29 Stalker, but the individual has never been identified. If you or anyone you know has information about the abduction and murder of Alicia Faye Showalter Reynolds, please contact the Virginia State Police at 804-750-8778 or email questions at vsp.virginia.gov. Alicia was abducted on March 2, 1996, and as of July 2026, this case remains unsolved. On the morning of February 18, 1988, a chilling rumor began spreading through the hallways of Lourdes Catholic High School in Cascade Township, Minnesota. Students were whispering that a 16-year-old sophomore named David Brom had slaughtered his entire family with an axe. While most dismissed it as a sick teenage prank, the staff at the school took it very seriously and called the sheriff's office, completely unaware of the horrors waiting at the Brom family home. Bernard Francis Brom was born on August 13, 1946, and everyone knew him as Barn. He was an advisory engineer at IBM in Rochester, where he'd worked since July of 1968. He was married to Paulette, who was born Paulette Joan Hagen on September 12, 1946. For years, she ran the preschool at Pax Christi Catholic Church before giving it up in the mid-1980s to spend more time with her 4 children, Joseph, David, Diane, and Richard. By 1988, both Barn and Paulette were 41 years old and serving as Eucharistic ministers at Pax Christi, where they helped lead its marriage counseling program. From the outside, they looked like your average church-going middle-class family, but behind closed doors, Barn and Paulette had become very strict on their kids after their oldest son, Joe, began to rebel. He was into punk rock music and made that his lifestyle, which included wearing eyeliner. While maybe not as big a deal today, in the 80s, to a deeply religious family, this was a major red flag and led to constant friction in the house over his lifestyle, and in 1988, 19-year-old Joe was kicked out. However, it did nothing to fix the tension in the home, and actually made it worse for the other kids, especially their second oldest child, David. Barn and Paulette felt they hadn't been strict enough on Joe and were not about to let the same thing happen to their other kids. So they tightened the rules in the home and began watching every move David made. This included monitoring everything he watched or listened to, aggressively banning secular, alternative, and punk rock music that they felt led to Joe's rebellion. He was also forbidden from adopting any alternative hairstyles, clothing choices, or anything that resembled the punk rock subculture. To enforce these rules, they began micromanaging every aspect of his daily schedule and overloaded him with exhausting chores and domestic responsibilities. They also heavily restricted who he could hang out with by vetting his high school friends and tracking his phone conversations to isolate him from what they felt were negative influences. When David would break the rules, he was severely grounded and received intense lectures from Barn and Paulette. Their other 2 children, 13-year-old Diane and 11-year-old Ricky, weren't put through the same scrutiny, mainly due to their ages. This eventually led David into a deep depression, and twice in 1987, he attempted to take his own life. Instead of loosening the reins to relieve David's stress, Barn and Paulette reacted by tightening the household restrictions. They simply believed that his depression and attempts at his own life were just signs that he was losing his way, much like his older brother Joe. So they pretty much cut him off from society and kept his schedule full of demanding chores, which included chopping firewood and handling the property maintenance. He was also tasked with doing the dishes, cleaning, and taking out the trash. On top of that, he was forced to spend hours doing intensive mechanical work on an old car that Barn was repairing. Once he was done with all his chores, he was put through intense faith-based counseling from his parents, which included daily prayers, scripture readings, and moral discussions. While chores aren't necessarily a bad thing for a teenager, the sheer volume of forced labor combined with his deep depression and his parents' relentless religious surveillance turned the Brom household from a safe haven into a ticking time bomb, and by late 1987, David was expressing to classmates his desire to kill his parents. Unfortunately, his friends dismissed it as a joke, mainly because David had a reputation for being a quiet, polite student from a prominent, deeply religious Catholic family, and nobody believed he was actually capable of violence. In January of 1988, he shared a detailed escape plan with two of his close friends. He proposed that they steal his parents' money, drive down to Florida for the vacation of a lifetime, and then take their own lives once the cash ran out. This plan never happened because the friends just didn't take him seriously. David was also writing letters to a female classmate detailing the dark, intrusive thoughts he was experiencing. He even mentioned hearing voices that were telling him to hurt himself and others. But because the teenager angst and edgy humor were common, she assumed it was just a dramatic way of complaining about his parents' rules and never reported it to school staff. Then came February 17, 1988. At around 11:30 that night, David got into a fierce argument with his father over an alternative music cassette tape he had found. Once the argument was over, David went to his room in a furious and unstable psychological state and began stewing in deep resentment for the next 3 hours. At some point between 1:30 and 3 a.m., he slipped down into the basement and grabbed a 28-inch splitting maul axe and carried it back upstairs to his parents' bedroom. He attacked his father first, leading to a struggle. However, David kept swinging, and once his father was dead, he turned the axe on his mother. He then murdered his brother, Ricky, before turning the axe on his sister, Diane, who had heard the commotion and had walked out of her bedroom and found her mother's body in the hallway. Once all 4 of his family members were dead, he took the blood-soaked axe back down to the basement before cleaning himself up and changing clothes. He then gathered some personal items and drove to school in his parents' blue van. He had no intentions of attending class and instead was looking for his female friend, Anik, that he'd been writing letters to. Once he found her, he convinced her to skip classes with him. As they drove away, David began calmly telling her he had followed through with his threats and killed his family. Even then, she didn't believe him until he began describing the horrific details of the attack. Despite the shock of the confession, Onyx stayed with him and began helping him put his escape plan into motion. They first went to her house, where David changed clothes once again. They then went to the local Kmart and bought gum and hair clippers. However, after returning to Onyx's home, her mother unexpectedly walked through the door and caught them skipping. Upset, she made Onyx return to school while David got back into his family's blue van and drove off. Once back at school, Onyx shared with her closest friends what David had told her. It then spread like wildfire and eventually reached the school's staff, who informed the sheriff's department. Meanwhile, David drove to the IBM credit union and withdrew $250 from his family account to fund his escape. He then returned home, shaved the sides of his head, and dyed his hair black in the first-floor bathroom. He then left the house again before deputies arrived at 5 p.m. 30 minutes later, he walked into Onyx's workplace, cornered her, and calmly told her he was officially on the run and would be sleeping under a bridge that night. Onyx was terrified and whispered to him, "I think they know," to which he responded, "Just don't tell." After leaving her workplace, David hid out near Valley High Drive in Rochester, spending the night inside a concrete drainage culvert. When police later searched the spot, they found his parents' stolen bank cash card, a comb, a toothbrush, candy, and soda cans. The following morning, he went to the Valley High Drive post office to use the public outdoor payphone. By this time, deputies had discovered the crime scene and were actively looking for David and had broadcast his photo on the local news. A community member who had watched the broadcast noticed David at the payphone and got close enough to hear him tell someone on the phone that it's too late now. The bystander immediately called the police, and officers swarmed the post office and took David into custody. Officers would later note that while David appeared tired and disheveled, he was still eerily calm and quiet as they placed him into the back of the squad car. The identity of the person he called has never been publicly released, but it was most likely one of his friends from school. What followed consumed the county for the next 20 months. Because David was 16, the case started in juvenile court, and the difference in outcome was enormous. A juvenile conviction would have him released on his 19th birthday, leading community members to be outraged at Judge Gerard Ring. He even received death threats. However, unbeknownst to many in the community, Judge Ring also disagreed with the ruling, but said he was simply following the law. The case eventually ended up at the Minnesota Supreme Court, and they ruled that David would be tried as an adult. The trial would end up going through 2 different phases. The first was over the facts, and with all the physical evidence and the testimony from David's own friends, he was quickly found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Then came the second phase. Under Minnesota's version of the insanity defense, a defendant cannot be held responsible if he did not understand what he was doing or that it was wrong. 8 mental health professionals had evaluated David, and 7 of them found him legally responsible. The 8th, however, a forensic psychologist, testified that David had been experiencing visual hallucinations for years and had 3 distinct alter egos, and attributed the killings to a psychotic episode. However, the jury didn't buy it and rejected the claim, and on October 16, 1989, David was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. Under the law as it stood then, that meant 17.5 years on each sentence before he could be considered for parole, a minimum of 52.5 years in prison. It was likely he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. That is, until 2012, when the United States Supreme Court held that states could not impose mandatory life without parole sentences on juveniles. In 2023, the Minnesota legislature abolished juvenile life sentences outright and created a 5-member supervised release board, including 2 experts in juvenile crime, to review these cases. The change applied retroactively and made parole a possibility for David. During a 2025 parole board hearing, David offered a direct apology, stating, "I'd just like to apologize to the family and friends of Bernard, Paulette, Diane, and Richard. I caused tremendous loss in their lives, incredible grief and pain, and left them with confusion and unanswered questions. And I apologize for that loss, for that grief, and for the murders that I committed." He went on to state that at the age of 16, he was in a severe cloud of depression, which had warped his thoughts and emotions.
Cloud of depression, I started to believe that other people were at fault. That fault I placed on my parents and my family.
He told the board he had spent decades trying to change everything about himself. During the hearing, mental health advocates who had maintained contact with David during his 37 years of incarceration noted that he frequently talked about how much he misses his family, deeply regrets snapping, and openly reflected on how much they loved him. It also helped that he had remained a model prisoner the entire time, finished his education, worked with computers, and trained to become an inmate chaplain. He also had support from Sheriff Kevin Torgerson, who was one of the 2 initial responding deputies who discovered the crime scene in 1998. Torgerson released a statement confirming that David had achieved a deep understanding of the gravity of his crimes, was genuinely remorseful, and had extended apologies to all parties impacted by the tragedy. While he was denied straight parole in January of 2025, he was allowed to leave the prison on a work release and moved into a halfway house in the Twin Cities under GPS monitoring and took a job in cabinetry. 6 months later, on January 27, 2026, he went before the Supervised Release Board again and was heavily questioned about his coping mechanisms and accountability. He told the board that in a clouded depression, he had come to believe other people were at fault for the way he felt, and that he considered himself an example of what a transformation could look like. The board then granted him parole by a vote of 5-2. Interestingly, David has declined every single interview request, a decision he still maintains to this day. While many in the community expressed skepticism over his rehabilitation, David continues to live out his life in Annika County, Minnesota, under strict community supervision. As for his brother Joe, he went on to college, became an assistant professor of economics and philosophy at a community college in Wintersville, Ohio, and taught there for 15 years before dying of cancer on January 5, 2016, at the age of 46.